Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. That is one hell of an attendance here, guys.
Clap for yourself.
And, well, my panelists are also a powerhouse, and we are looking forward to this conversation. I'm going to kick it off because, to justify the time we have been given, and the clock is already ticking. Sam escaped my last panel in Bangalore thanks to Indigo, but he's clearly not gone very far. So, Sam, I'm going to kick this off with you because I've got a lot of pending questions from the last time around. When we speak about the partition, we are always speaking about, in a collective sense, the rebuilding process. What gets left behind is the unmaking of homes, the unmaking of community, the unmaking of emotions. So I'm just going to quote this from Gyanendra Pandey in Remembering Partition, where he says, "How much violence and intolerance has it taken to produce the successful nation states of the 20th century? How many partitions did it take to make the partition of 1947? Sam, how do you understand the collectiveness of partition and its unmaking?
Partition is, firstly, thank you everyone for coming. This is, as Jyotsna was just saying, one hell of an audience. Partition is the central event, one of the central events of the 20th century, and certainly the central event of 20th century South Asia. And I think that, I think it was Aisha Jalal who said that it remains the prism through which a quarter of the world's population continues to perceive its past, present, and future, the way that India interacts with its neighbors, the way that kind of, Hindu and Muslim populations in the world interact with one another. And what's extraordinary about it is the sheer breadth of partition experience. I think we're going to get into this a bit later, but the fact, I think we often limit it to the border regions that were themselves ruptured, where we can see that dividing line on the map. The regions that bestride the border, like Punjab, Gujarat, Sindh, Bengal. But one of the things that I think triggered me to write the book that I did was actually speaking with people who had migrated often from places that we don't associate with partition at all. Learning about the Tamil community of Tamil Muslims that now lives in Karachi, or meeting families that now live in Tripura that migrated from Bangladesh. And the fact that I think the major thing that triggered me to write my book was learning that Tripura in northeast India is actually the state that is linguistically and demographically changed the most as a result of partition, and yet we very rarely refer to it when talking about partition. And the way that these composite identities were destroyed, not just the kind of ones that tend to be highlighted in the media, in the movies we consume, in the books that we read. But I think that one of the things that I found fascinating but tragic is how almost every part of the subcontinent you can go to, and there will be some, Gurdwara that's been abandoned as the family moved to India, or a mosque that's been abandoned in India that represents a community who now lives in Karachi. It's very, once you start looking for it, it's everywhere, and you can't go to Humayun's tomb in Delhi without sort of seeing the fact that this was one of the largest refugee camps in partition, despite the fact that it's all a pristine UNESCO World Heritage Site, and we all, the Mughal heritage of the region is always highlighted. The fact that much of these Delhi monuments that we now go and visit were once the refugee camps for the largest forced migration in history. And so, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
I have to say I am one of those guilty ones who's also written on Punjab partition and, focused on that, which, Kishwar, is something that, you've been involved with as well. Why do you think there was so much emphasis that came to this side and this partition?
Well, to begin with, thank you everybody who's here today. It's a huge step forward from when we started our work in setting up the museums in Amritsar and Delhi. because at that time we needed to set up the world's first partition museum, and nobody understood it. I mean, what were we going to do? Why were we making this museum at all? And the importance of it. So even our outreach programs were all about sensitizing people and telling them that this was a world-changing event. It wasn't just an event which impacted the 20 million who moved from here to there, from there to here, and it wasn't just the lives that were lost, it wasn't just about the violence, but the long-lasting impact the partition in 1947 had on many of our lives. And I can tell you, even looking at this audience, that almost everybody here will know someone who's been impacted by the partition, if not within their own families, but somewhere maybe outside of it. So when we started looking at the Partition Museum, setting it up, it was a huge dilemma where to set it, because we were looking at Delhi, as Sam and Jyotsna just mentioned. All the monuments and everything were representative of what had happened to Delhi during the partition of India when they became refugee camps. But apart from that, as we did our research, we realized that all of Delhi was like one large refugee camp. And the first exhibition we did in Delhi, we actually put those dots, out on the map of Delhi to show where those refugee camps had existed. So everything, whether you look at a Lajpat Nagar, whether you look at a Friends colony, whether, anything from the poorest area to the most, luxurious parts of Delhi, Khan Market, all of these were refugee camps once upon a time because of the huge influx of refugees who came. I don't think, Jyotsna, that we were focused on one side of the story. We were not, because though my parents came from Lahore, and my mother's side of the family came with absolutely nothing, just one small suitcase. I mean, that's all they were able to carry across the border. And they had to rebuild their lives from scratch. Many families were like that. But we were fortunate enough to have access to archival research of oral histories that had already been recorded in Bengal. So those were shared with us. So many of those oral histories are there. But because the museum is in Amritsar, and it's a long story, I won't get into it, but very briefly, literally had to go and beg for a building because there was no, there was nothing that we could do quickly enough. Already when we started 10 years ago, people were in the evening of their lives. My dad, who passed recently, was already in his 90s. I had to record him. We had to record all those people who were eyewitness to the partition. So what is the museum, we realized, going to be based on? It was going to be a people's museum. So it was a museum about love, loss, longing. It was a museum where the last gallery is called the Gallery of Hope. It was going to reach out to the people in Punjab and Bengal, and now you'll be happy to know that we also have included the lost homeland of Sindh. Indeed, it's the only place in the entire world where Sindhis can come and look at what their homes were like, what their language was like, the importance of Sindh, which we've forgotten now, Mohenjo-daro, all those areas which are now for many of us left behind in Pakistan. So we also set up that gallery, and all of this was done through donations. So I just want to say that our emphasis was not just on Punjab, not just on Bengal, albeit a lot of people do focus on Punjab because of the violence. In Bengal, it was spread over many, many decades, and it went on. The migration went on. So it wasn't as though it was over. In Punjab, it was much more brutal and faster. So therefore, there was a lot of writers, not us specifically, but a lot of writers did emphasize on that, therefore. And it was something that we were aware of when we began, that we have to try and focus on Bengal. And we were asked to do a museum in Bengal as well, but anyway, therefore, due to lots of reasons, we couldn't do that. But we do have one in Delhi, we do have one in Amritsar, and we try and give that kind of emphasis on Sindhis as well.
Yes, which is a good cue for me to get Bhawana in as well. Bhawana, you've written about your family from Karachi. Amidst this slew of partition stories that are coming out, how did you expect to stand out?
So the best thing about my memoir, which is chronicling my family legacy, the great-grandfather, grandfather, my parents, is that not many people know that even Gujaratis suffered the pain of partition. And not many people know that it is a specific community called Lohanas. The Lohanas are descendants of Raghuvanshi Ram and Love and Kush. So we are the descendants of love. And slowly the name became Loharna and then it became Lohana. And that's how my great-grandfather went from Kutch to Karachi in 1836. And then he started doing business with his uncle. And slowly he realized that he was smarter than all and started independently. And my parents, as I said in my earlier lecture, were in school when my grandparents showed them to each other, and the wedding was fixed. My father was 18, my mother was 16. They got married. They lived in a large joint family of more than 30 people. And slowly my grandfather realized that there were too many children, too many women, too many men, and we needed to separate out. And that's how the nuclear families happened. A lot of people ask me that what, as a film critic, made me write this book. I had been chronicling biopics and cinema analysis for so many decades. And even though I heard Karachi stories at the dining table from my older siblings, my uncles, my mamas, my masis, it was always something that happened to somebody. It was not yet touching my heart for somehow. Even though I interviewed the Yash Chopra, the B.R. Chopra, Sunil Dutt, Rajendra Kumar, Manoj Kumar, and everybody had some reference to the partition and how they walked, and they came here. Then one day I felt that out of the 8 siblings, 5 had passed away, and it was time for me as the writer of the family to chronicle the legacy of this wonderful story. Because for me, Karachi is not a neighboring city. I've been hearing stories of Karachi at all my uncle, aunts, and my home. For me, she's a lost sibling who I never saw. So I longed to go to Karachi. It never happened. It came close to me having an immigration stamp on my passport, but it was not meant to be. Then a celebrity friend of mine told me that you're writing this, but will people be interested? Because people are interested in stories of superstars and celebrities. And if you're writing a memoir about your family and the pain it went through, I said, I don't care. It is a story that touches me, it breaks me, and it is not about people and what they think. It is about documenting what happened to the Lohana community, to this particular family that was at the cusp of partition. It's about tradition, it is about custom, it's about cuisine, it is about festivals, the way it is celebrated, the family life, the joint families, and how all that continues to this date. You know, our food was influenced by Sindh, and there are a lot of dishes that we make which is so much like Sindhi. So Sindhi and Kutchi sound similar too. And the reason I felt distant earlier was because I am the 8th child of my parents, and I was born to my mother when she was in a menopause at 45. And my grandmother told my mother that be careful because my older sister was already born. Older sister, that is the 7th sibling, after coming to India. They left with 6 children, came to India, and then the 7th sibling was born after a decade. And she said, be careful because your fertility cycle is of 2 years. And my mother said, no, I am in menopause and you don't worry.
And you live to tell the tale.
And 2 years later, she was pregnant. And the doctor once again advised that, you know, you should go through an abortion because there were so many children. And the first time when the 7th sibling came, my parents were absolutely against it. And this time they did consider because, you know, she was so weak and she was so feeble. She had, I think, no milk in her, you know, and she ate all the kitchen remedies so that I would give up. But I had to tell the tale, so I had to be born.
That's what I said. You live to tell the tale, Bhavna. And Sam, this nostalgia that Bhavna has, I have, she has for Karachi, I have for Lahore, my family there. You've spoken to a lot of survivors, you've spoken to a lot of families. Is nostalgia contingent on the kind of displacement and rehabilitation that happened? For instance, you know, this whole refugee status was not one generic term. Somebody was rehabilitated to a better home, somebody continued to live in tents for much longer. So is nostalgia then contingent on how you look back and how you rebuild?
I think nostalgia is there across to some extent. There are obviously, with a lot of people, it's wrapped up deeply in trauma, but I think universally across younger generations of partition survivors, you can see it, even if the survivors themselves don't want to dwell on the past because of the traumas that they witnessed. But I think even the linguistics of the term refugee, for example, the way that there are different terms depending on different communities, notably Sharanarthi, Mohajir, it's notable that any Muslim from North India who migrated, who Urdu speakers, are referred to by one term in Pakistan, for example, Mohajir. If you move from Lucknow or Delhi, you're a Mohajir. If you moved from one side of Punjab to another side of Punjab, though, you're not considered a Mohajir. And it's interesting how the terms that, the terms that we use to refer to that migration differ depending on, different communities' experiences. I think that I also know lots of people who object to the term refugee altogether because of the fact that they say, we left one part of India for another part of India, and in some sense it's a political stance to reject that division that forced people from their homes. And they say, no, we're not refugees, we've just been forced out of our home to a different part of our home. But in some sense, to claim one's new homeland is to say that we're not refugees, we've moved from one part of the country to another part of the country. So I think it's complex, it's wrapped in layers of trauma, but also longing. And I think that you mentioned this at the beginning, Kishwar. I think that far too often we only emphasize the horrors that accompanied partition, and the horror, and it's used to justify animosity towards the other community on the other side of the border. The fact that actually, we were chatting about this beforehand, the vast majority of people who any of us have interviewed about this in our oral history projects were very often saved by members of the other community. Almost always, when I was doing my Project Astan, trying to reconnect families across the divide, there was almost always some family that existed on the other side of the border that people wanted to reconnect with and say thank you to. One of the most emotional stories I came across was in 1971, after the Bangladesh War. There was a group of Sikhs who arrived at the prisoner of war camp and tried to argue with the army officers, the Indian army officers, to release one particular man because his family had, although he's now Pakistani, his family had saved their family when they were coming to India, and they wanted to repay the debt that their lives were owed to this man's father, who was now a prisoner of war in India. And time again, I can't remember the name of this man who wrote this memoir of being a prison guard in India, guarding the Pakistani prisoners of war. But it was fascinating how much this longing and want to reconnect was found amongst even the Pakistani prisoners of war kept in India for 3 years after 71.
So Kishwar, I'm taking off from what Sam said. That missing narrative, that happened immediately after partition, perhaps. You're looking at a collective conflict. You're looking at a collective displacement. But did you find that initially there is this missing space of everyone's a victim, but then somebody had to be a perpetrator too?
Yes, and the sad reality is that we came across both sides of the story. I mean, there were very, very difficult narratives to negotiate, even within my own family, where people were either forced to change their religions and stay behind, or they could definitely have moved across the border having lost everything. So there were all kinds of pressures and pulls which were on both sides of the border, I would say, not just in one particular area. But I think Sam is right that there were many of these narratives which we also put up in our museum. There is one extremely moving letter, for example, by this, written by this man to the powers that be, because he rescued a Muslim woman who was being sort of abused by these perpetrators who were existed in every community at that time. So he rescued her, he married her, and he was looking after her, but in the exchange later, in the exchange of so-called, the women who had been abducted by the other side, the Pakistanis wanted to take her back. And he wrote this really difficult, it's a very difficult letter to read even now, 70 years after it. And he's begging them that I love her, I want to keep her with me, but you are sort of taking her away from me. That was, of course, one. The other is a pulkari we have there, which was given to us by someone whose grandmother had been rescued by a Muslim. So it was in memory of that had been given. There are people who hid Muslim children in Chandni Chowk under, Naveen told me, Naveen Chawla, whom most of you know, that his mother, who was a doctor, she sort of hid these little Muslim kids under the bed so that they would be safe. There are thousands of these stories. So it isn't that it was all violence, it was all bloody. Remember, these were people who were neighbors, who actually knew each other. And last, I just want to give one small narrative. When we were setting up the Partition Museum, there was this gentleman who was well into his 90s called Amar, who wrote to us saying that I want to give you letters to put, which are in the museum now. And these letters were an exchange between him and his Muslim friends across the border, and they continued for years. Not only that, his wife actually kept a Muslim man in her house in Old Delhi for many years, and she told everybody around that it's my brother. And everyone said, how can you have a brother? You never had a brother. He said, oh, he was on a ship and all that. Do you know that gentleman was so moved by what she'd done, he never went to Pakistan after that. He just decided to stay on. And, and he lived in Nizamuddin, actually, for many years. So there are these stories of connections that never died, even despite the line that was drawn, and there were connections which survived, where people refused to move. I mean, they said, no, but these are communities that we've grown up with. Why should we move?
It takes me back to after my family came from Lahore. They were given a house that belonged to a Pakistani landlord. And about, I think, 10 years after independence, my grandfather saw somebody standing outside. And he realized it was the same man. The man had just come back to look at the house. So my grandfather told him, why don't you just come in? I will give you the house. It's yours. And he said, I would come back tomorrow. It's my family who doesn't want to come back. So, things happened. There was that nostalgia. And taking it from there, Bhavna, the younger generation, people like Sam are doing such fantastic stuff in making history accessible. But there is a generation today that is, on social media, learning misinformation, not the right history. How do you look at how are they going to internalize what is so dear to us in the coming generation?
Before I answer that, I want to just add to something that you said and something Kishwar said. This man not wanting to go back, or that woman he didn't want to send back. So when I was a junior reporter with film magazine, Noor Jahan had come to India. And my editor, we used to have a feature called Once Upon a Time, where we used to take the star to his old home, the modest home, where he started, like Jitendra going to Girgaon and all that. And we used to make them sit in the chawl and, narrate stories of Anil Kapoor and all. And he had told me that you will travel with Noor Jahan. I was really fresh, and we didn't know the telephone number. She just knew the address, and that also not properly. The photographer, me, and the driver, and Noor Jahan. And she said, "आप ये सड़क पे ले लीजिए और मैं ऐसे ही बता दूँगी." She didn't know the address. तो हम लोग गाड़ी में बैठे और वो सड़क पे जैसे वो बताती गई हम गए और अभी वहाँ पहुँचकर हमें पता नहीं हम कैसे करने वाले हैं. तो she looked at me, so I rang the bell and the watchman opened the door. A big nice bungalow type of a house in South Bombay. And he said, जी, तो मैंने कहा कि हम अंदर आना चाहते हैं. तो he said नहीं आ सकते हैं. तो मैंने कहा आप मालिक को ज़रा दरवाजे पर बुलाइए. तो fortunately the मालिक या मालकिन जो भी थी वो बाहर आई. And Noorjahan smiled at her. She was much younger, not as young as I was, but younger than Noorjahan. Maybe she didn't recognize her. तो Noorjahan said, मैं Noorjahan हूँ और एक समय पर मैं यहाँ रहती थी. मैं आज भी ये बोलती हूँ तो मेरे रोंगटे खड़े हो जाते हैं. And then I explained and I said, we want to just come inside. She just wants to look around the house. And if you don't mind, I want to just take a few pictures because I didn't want to disappoint my editor. We are also scared of them at that time. And it was just so moving. And she had a music session which was organized by the film fraternity and the state, जहाँ दिलीप कुमार को नूरजहाँ को इंट्रोड्यूस करना था. और दिलीप साहब ने इतनी खूबसूरती से इंट्रोड्यूस कहा कि जितने सालों से नूरजहाँ ने कहा कि मैं सालों से भारत आना चाहती थी. तो दिलीप साहब ने कहा कि जितने सालों से आप हमारे देश आना चाहते थे उतने ही सालों से हमने आपका इंतज़ार किया है.
That's lovely. Can I just add a little bit to this? Because this was in the 1950s. My father was a young police officer posted in Amritsar. And suddenly one day, a team of people from the film industry arrived at his doorstep. Bhagwan, and along with him was Lata Mangeshkar and so on. The younger lot here won't know who I'm talking about, but possibly you know about these actors and singers. And they barged in and they asked him, they said that, can you, because my dad was also from Lahore, and they said that, can you help us meet Noorjahan? Lata Mangeshkar wanted to meet her because she said she was my colleague and, you know, we used to share such happy times. Yeah. So then my dad called up his friends from across the border because he used to study in Government College Lahore and so on. So his were equivalent on the other side. And they said, sure, why not? So they all met at the border. Noorjahan came from one side, Lata Mangeshkar came from this side, and they all sat and picnicked, and they had kebabs at the border, and they sang well into the evening, exchanging stories and narratives.
The border was a little bit more fluid those days.
Yeah.
So
and these were people who did not fear, you know, that there would be any reprisals. So these were, but see, look at that nostalgia which you're talking. Even then, it existed, those meetings. So one thing which we have done in the museum is we go beyond the fact that there was violence or there was a partition line. We talk about the divisions which took place. There is a gallery called the Gallery of Divisions, which took place at every level. This included the museum, it included the Rashtrapati Bhavan, which is now Rashtrapati, at that time it was the Viceroy's house, where the crockery, cutlery, the bodyguard, everything was. The museums were hilarious because they separated the necklaces and gave 4 beads to India, 5 beads to Pakistan, everything.
And we're going to hope lots of them go there.
51,000 crores to each.
Yeah. So it was everything down the line. And that is what we must remember as countries, that when partition happens, it divides culture. It divided the film industry. It divided the cricket team. And, you know, we would have been a world-beating cricket team had the two, India and Pakistan, stayed together. Because it would have been amazing. So many things. The army, the police, everything. So people who had worked together were now facing each other across the border.
We're really running out of time, but I want to ask Sam a question from that nostalgia, and I'm going to end that there. So Sam, you know, I know Bhawana mentioned somewhere in the book that one of the legacies of this was that, you know, always wanted a roof on her head. I spoke to a Pakistani writer who said that after his family left India's side of Punjab, his father never bought a house. He said houses are for fools, and he lived in a rented property. What then is belonging? Is it what you inherit, or is it nostalgia?
That's a big question, and I think that the answer is both, and belonging is what you make of it. it's amazing the moments of serendipity that life throws at you and the ways that people adjust, move on with their lives, but I think also always carry a portion of home. There's a story that I'd love to end on, which is my friend, our family friend Martin, who his family came from Lahore, and when he was at university, he moves into these university halls and meets Pakistanis for the first time, and they all hang out, they watch the cricket, they do that thing that is uniquely rare in the subcontinent, unlike the other great clashing points of the modern world, unlike Russians and Ukrainians, unlike Israelis and Palestinians. You know, Indians and Pakistanis go abroad and they're all best friends, they're all eating together, then they're all dating each other and kind of partying with each other, listening to the same music. And anyway, Marthand does this and becomes great friends with this Pakistani guy, and one day recognizes a picture that his Pakistani friend has on his wall in his halls, and it turns out that his friend lived in his ancestral home in Lahore, and they'd been moved into the same thing, and you know they then bonded over this. The two families met later. He managed to help sponsor Marthan to go and visit Lahore, where he was able to stay in his ancestral home. But you know there are these moments of serendipity that allow you to.
We managed to find out for ourselves as well.
Yeah, and I always say this to people at my talks, which is you know, if get the addresses down before your grandparents disappear, because you never know when, you know, the Berlin Wall will fall and it'll be possible to visit again. And if that happens, you want to be able to know where on the other side of the border your family came from. And it's looking less and less likely, of course. But then, you know, people said that during the Cold War, and suddenly we live in a world with a united Germany. And you never know what the future holds.
And if you want to watch an Indian and a Pakistani watching cricket together, just head to Dubai.
And if you want to know more about how the partition happened and how the leaders went under duress, watch Freedom at Midnight on whichever channel.
All right, we are going to quickly just bring out the best questions, guys. We have no time.
And ask questions, not statements.
Thank you so much for such an insightful discussion. A quick question. Many of your projects like Project Dastan or the Museum of Partition and other things are based on a lot of narrative and oral history and memories and so on. And I am a teacher at a university, and a lot of my academic colleagues say that this is all narrative based on memory and nostalgia and not based on facts, as they call it, or archival material.
What is the question?
So how do we explain to them, the academic historians, that this is where you touch real people, not just through archives, but through talking to survivors, talking to descendants like you, like me, my grandparents came from Lahore, and so on. So how do we explain to them?
This is something, Kishwar, we were speaking about, does it become a judgment call at some point as well?
Totally. I think if you really look into it, all history is based on some oral history or the other. It may be some emperor somewhere talking about his memoirs, which we have to take for granted, and that's how we've learnt our history. But this is the history of ordinary people that we have, for example, in the museum. And we do fact check. I mean, we do, if they mention a particular date or an event, then we do go back, wherever it is possible. If they were children at that time, and they are talking about what happened to their families, that is also something that you can check with other family members. We try and do all that. In the museum, we also have objects, which makes it much more real. So these are objects which they carried across the border. And through that, and some letters and documents, and their refugee cards. We have the refugee cards also with us in the museum, which have been donated by, you know, we have about 1,000 people associated with the museum in Amritsar, and maybe another 500 associated with the museum in Delhi. So it becomes possible for us, not every point which they talk about, but I think all history somewhere does have oral history in it.
Sam, do you want to add?
Yeah, I think all sources need to be critically analyzed as sources, and just like you check any source for biases, for for potential kind of conflicts of interest, etc. If you were, if you check whether something's propaganda or not when reading a government document. So you treat oral history as a source, but the point is that we only have a few more years to get down this range of possible sources. Why do we trust a published book more than orality or a government archive when we know all of these things lie, all of these things can tell the truth? We need to analyze all of them using the same critical lens.
We can take 2 more quick questions and very quick answers. All right.
Lady on the
Where?
Yeah, pretty insightful session. Just one comment. My house is right 200 meters from the Partition Museum in Amritsar, and I totally relate. My question specifically to Bhawana ma'am. So after the partition, you see that the Hindi film industry is predominantly, or let's say, dominated by Punjabis. So is this specifically only due to the passion or the desperation to make a new living?
No, I think a lot of Punjabis migrated and a lot of Punjabis made it in cinema. That is why Karan Johar used to always say, okay, these are all people who speak in Punjabi but make films in Hindi. And one day I told Karan in the course of our conversation that I'm tired of Karwa Chauths and all that nonsense. And soon came Sanjay Leela Bansali from my language, and he gave us Garbas. So I don't think we have any complaints, everything is all right. Before the mic is taken away from me, I want to say it's wonderful to see a packed house, and please translate this into buying our books. You know, a writer spends such lonely hours in front of the computer, and hardly that kind of sales translate into commerce. Please respect our efforts.
Including of the moderator.
And visiting the museum.
It's a very good museum.
One last question. We've done a nice sales pitch, guys, for ourselves. Yeah, that's it. Okay, we'll take the last 2 very quickly because.
Can this museum concept be tailored in such a way to prevent India from breaking up into, small, like, this is my state and this becomes my country kind of thing, because it will be the same pain that people will experience. So how can we get this to kind of make people realize that this is the kind of pain that can happen?
You see, what we did and why we did the museum was precisely not that we feared that India would break up, but to prevent any further divisions within communities. Because already we felt so much had happened. If people just visit the museum and they see the ravages that were inflicted on communities and what happened and the horrific narratives that people have to tell, then they would themselves be moved. You don't have to tell them. So the thing is that we decided, let's just put all those narratives out there, and now we have school children who come, we have college kids who come, a lot of young people visit the museum. The last gallery is called the Gallery of Hope, where we talk about how communities come together and, sometimes visit each other's homes or exchange narratives, do things together. And that is what we hope is going to happen to the India of the future and India of now. So the museum has a message. It's a message of peace, to live peaceably amongst each other and to help each other. But that, you don't have to write it. You just have to go through this museum, which is an immersive museum. You can just feel it and understand it, and hopefully the message comes through.
All right, that's one last question because the gentleman was already starting, and whoever has to answer will do this in 30 seconds.
A quick question to Sam, and you probably need 5 seconds. In your lifetime, given that you're probably the youngest on the panel, do you, if you do a little bit of crystal ball gazing, you reckon will there ever be reconciliation in South Asia?
I think that, particularly after the events of this April and May, I think that we're at a very dangerous time, and certainly at an official level, things have rarely been this bad. But as I mentioned before, it gives me hope that still abroad, you know, college kids from India and Pakistan will always be best friends the moment they go to Dubai or the UK or the US. And it's a strange, unique thing amongst kind of countries that at an official level have such poisonous relationship. The frankly fantastic individual relationships that continue despite these conflicts, despite, you know, the events that continue to, the continued division, the continued events in Kashmir, you know, the recent fighting, the recent drone fights and missiles, etc. Despite this, there is still so much desire for reconciliation, and I think that on an individual level, that happens every day abroad when Indians and Pakistanis meet. The Project Astan, this organization that I worked with, basically had its founding because of this strange realization that, like, why is it that it's only here in the UK, you know, South Asia's former colonizer, that Indians, Pakistanis, and Bangladeshis could all sit in one room. And this strange realization that, you know, we've talked a lot about lost homelands, but the fact that these places are still there, and all that's required for us to revisit these homelands is a kind of diplomatic easing between the two countries. And we have come close in the past. I think that, you know, people often say that we're living, you know, particularly with the Hindu nationalism in the country at the moment, etc. And we forget that Vajpayee, the first BJP prime minister, probably saw the closest that we came with the Agra summit, etc., to a long-lasting, complete easing of tensions. And that could happen again. It just requires political will.
And I think we should always remember that politics is a game, and we should be smart people and not get played by the politicians. On that note, much was asked, much is still left, but I have to let it go because the siren has rung many times. Sam, Kishwar, and Bhavana, it was lovely. Fantastic panel. Thank you very much.
You were fantastic.